welcome to Viewpoints, brought to you by Equature, the leading provider in public safety training and software. My name is Cherie Bartram, and I will be co-hosting today with Kerry O'Connell. A little bit about Equature before we get started. We are an international leader in public safety training and technology, with products geared toward providing tools to help responders stay safe and educated. For those of you who are new, we offer monthly podcasts with a variety of guests geared toward public safety topics, as well as monthly webinars and a diverse offering of training courses. Today on our show, we are going to do something we've never done before. We are going to review together, the two of us, our 2024 podcasts, the highlights, what we learned, what was funny, what really stuck with us, what left us speechless, and we're going to pass that on to you. Our podcasts are always available on the platforms that that we have them offered on, just like this one today. These highlights will cover Kerry's reviews, as well as some of the moments I enjoyed most with each of our presentations. So before we begin, Kerry, I want to thank you for bringing this idea to life. I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, good. I thought it might be a fun thing to just review things, because as I looked through the podcast, there were so many interesting moments in there that spurred memories in my career.
Great. So let's start off. We're going to start from January, and we'll just go from there. So January 2024, our very first podcast of the year was Generational Differences with Mo. Tell me, the audience, what really resonated with you on that one.
Well, she talked about flexibility with being flexible with some of these generations. And I mean, I know I tried to do that as a director in my PSAP. And one of the discussions I had that was kind of interesting was, you've got these trainees, and then I had a full-time dispatcher who'd been there for 20 years who said, I don't think the trainees should be allowed to go out for lunch. And I looked at her and I said, I don't know what you're talking about, because you have to be here in case we need you. So that's one of our policies. However, a trainee practically isn't a real person yet in our dispatch. And I think that's something that, as we're going through this, we don't even know if they're going to make it through training. So how are we supposed to treat them as a full-time dispatcher when they're so early in their career? Right? That was kind of what it reminded me of as she was talking.
I like how straightforward Mo is with just, calling it out. I learned a lot from listening to her about just getting people past getting out of their own way about their perceptions.
Yeah, I liked how she said our 4-letter word, which is I'm fine. Fine.
Right.
How often we say that, and actually we tell ourselves that too. I'm fine. Yeah.
I'm fine.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to talk about it.
Right. Exactly. Especially, so many times you have so little time to actually assess your own, mental status. And so when people are asking you, you're like throwing it over your shoulder. I'm fine. Keep going.
Right. Move along.
Yep. I don't have time to talk to you.
And what's so funny about that also, which really has not much to do with Mo's podcast, is, we have learned throughout all of the training on, taking care of ourselves, that talking is really one of the greatest things we can do to help reduce our stress. Saying fine, isn't really helpful.
No. Well, and when I also think about time pressures, and how urgent, our jobs are, most of the time. I remember having a conversation, gosh, this was just, I think, at our last conference about staffing. And, when they look at law enforcement staffing, they talk about, I'm sorry, you've got to have time in between calls. You've got to. And so you have to do your staffing in that way. And when you analyze how much time, especially a lot of these short staff centers have, they're you can't even support each other practically in between calls because there's not enough staff to allow for that. So hopefully once we get our staffing level better, we can actually be better at these generational differences and treat people as individuals and not as a group as we've been forced to do.
And that was something that I liked, Mo giving insight into how to look at things right now that we can do differently,
Yeah,
whether we have the staffing or not.
right, right.
All right. Well, so then we moved on to Jimmy. We talked about PSAP consolidations. Now, PSAP consolidations can be one of those taboo topics.
Right,
People don't
right.
always want to talk about it. I don't know all of your experiences, Kerry, with PSAP consolidations, how you felt about it. So when you listened to that, what kind of thoughts were running through your head?
Well, I don't have direct experience with consolidations. I think you do, Sherry. Um, I have experience talking to people who have either been through it or have turned it down. And my recent experiences with a couple of PSAPs that, or multiple PSAPs who have actually turned it down for whatever reasons. And it always comes down to relationships. Somebody doesn't trust the other. It also comes down to unions. And are there unions? Aren't there unions? Are the pay differentials something that they can even get past? You know, and I actually had one consolidation that did go through that was a university consolidated with an actual PSAP, and I got the feeling that the administration on that side was like, oh, hooray, I get to get rid of these employees because we all know that we're an interesting group.
True.
So I'm curious what your experiences were especially when you were sitting through this podcast.
Well, I had several consolidations that I worked with directly, or agencies contacted me, and that's exactly what they said. We're sick and tired of this dispatch center. We want to dump them. I just wanted to, take the dispatch center just to protect them, but I think probably the best consolidation I went through was right after I moved to Michigan, because I worked in a county dispatch center, and the dispatchers in that county dispatch center were phenomenal. They all union. They were consolidating with the city was coming to the county, and they were like, okay, well, we got to do contract negotiations. We want them to come in right where their seniority is. We don't want them to go to the bottom of our seniority. So if they had 10 years, they came in right into the 10-year spot. I mean, almost unheard of. They
Yeah.
were so gracious to the joining center. Most all of if not all of them, the city dispatchers came over to the central dispatch, where we were. Um, it was still, I just think of how great they were.
Wow.
They went with the agency who had the highest pay, which was the central dispatch center where I was. I mean, it was just a great consolidation. Now, the city dispatchers, for them, they were told, I'm never going to let you go, never going to let you go, never going to let you go. And they got a fax one day from their union steward saying, okay, well, the consolidation is in, like, it was like a month. We really need to get this going. That was the first time they'd heard of it. So they were caught a little off guard. We knew all about it. So that was probably the communication was lacking on their side.
Right.
And you're right. It comes down to um, relationships and communicating and being as transparent as you can.
Yeah.
Sometimes the giving up agency, the closing down agency, didn't want the transparency because they had to go so long and they didn't want all their people to leave.
Well,
So
and the university I'm talking about, I think they only ended up with two people coming over. I mean, I think like the other four left. They didn't want to consolidate. So yeah, it really does come down to that. It really does come down to relationships and mostly about administration relationships.
yeah, Jimmy, some of the things he was talking about is building a new center, and that's got to be one of the funnest things to do,
Oh
especially
yeah.
when you include the dispatch staff in those decisions. What kind of floor do you want? What kind of council do you want? Let's look at phones and radios and CAD. I mean, every decision you can include them in. So I liked that part of Jimmy's presentation. Um, because I building a new center is a lot of work, but it's a blast. So
Yeah.
I thought he had a lot of really good information.
Yeah. Yeah. No, they and to include dispatchers is so important, and I don't know that they even believe that their voice is being heard during all of that because there's so many voices going on. And that's where it comes down to administration too, is to take what they're suggesting in a reasonable way because you can't have everything for everybody, um,
Right.
but at least to weed through those and say, yeah, this one rises to the top, and let's use this suggestion, and it's just yeah, it actually can either make relationships stronger during that process or it can really hurt some.
Right. Right. Just one really quick story. We had a we had a kitchen that we were painting in one of the dispatch centers I worked at. And, we were trying to get input, but the people weren't saying much, and so we had a couple people pick this yellow. Yellow is not my favorite color. I would not have picked yellow, but I'm like, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm not painting. And they're like, no, 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 we'll paint, we'll paint. Okay, paint. So they painted it yellow, and I was thinking, oh, it'll be bright and cheery. Oh, it was bright yellow. Um, I got so many complaints on that yellow. I can't believe you like them better than us. I mean, it was.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
felt bad, but it was done. So I went out, with my own money and tried to buy some pictures and kitchen things to like offset the very bright sunshiny yellow. It was really, really bright. But sometimes getting that dispatcher feedback that could backfire. So for our
Yeah.
audience,
Yeah.
I would just say, use caution.
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder if that kitchen is still yellow. I'm hoping, maybe not. Maybe a gentler color would be
Yeah.
better. But my heart was in the right place. It's just, whew.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Oh, that's a funny story.
Oh, all right. So in March, we had officer safety and training with Captain Reed Harrington, um, out of Mississippi. What'd you think of Captain Harrington?
Oh, he was wonderful. He made me think of a couple of things. One, why does it take so little time to train an officer as compared to a dispatcher? I mean, it's just one of those things where, I mean, I went to we were, we were really working on trying to improve our dispatch center. We went to another dispatch center and went with a fire chief, and he was the one that came back to me and he says, "Oh, that dispatch center is really wonderful. Do you believe they get their dispatchers trained in 6 weeks?" I went, "They do?" He said, "Well, yeah, that's their academy when they bring new dispatchers in, and then they're dispatchers." I said, "No, you didn't understand what they were saying." Their academy is 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever it was. I said, then they go on the floor and start a whole nother phase of training. So their training really is not that much different as far as time frame than ours. He says, "Oh, that isn't what I understood." I said, "No, because you wanted to understand what you were hoping would be the case." And so, I mean, that's where I look at, I mean, and I'm not saying that law enforcement or firefighters, I mean, they have ongoing training. So they're never done training, just like we're never done training. But it just seems like, even though law enforcement usually has an 8 week or 12 week academy, you know, that the FTO process that they go through is generally so much less time, not intensity, but time, you know, than ours, than our FTO process.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why. And um, I know you and I are working on this, but background checks are not as extensive either, oftentimes,
Oh, for dispatch?
for dispatch.
Yeah.
Um, and you kind of have to wonder why that is. Um,
Yeah.
I know Captain Harrington didn't talk about that, but he was talking about officer safety and then training in itself. Um, yeah, he did have good advice, regardless of whether you're a new leader or an old leader or you want to be a leader. Listen to your people. I thought I thought that was good advice that he passed on.
Well, the other thing that he talked about, um, that really made me think, was when he talked about some of the new recruits, the newer, officers that are just coming off of FTO, and how often their insight is not accepted as well from the more experienced officers. And that reminded me of, have you ever read that book, um, Crew Resource, oh, I'll find it, Management. Have you ever read that book?
No.
Yeah, so it has a whole thing on there about listen to your new people and give them the same level of respect and for what they are recommending for a certain incident as you would your older ones, um, because they have a whole new perspective that you might not have because you've been there so long, you're doing it the way everything's recognized in a certain way. And I really did talk to my dispatchers about that too, is that, you know what, some of these new trainees, I don't care if they're even off training, they could have some really good perspectives on how to improve what we do, and you need to listen to that. Crew resource management comes from the airline industry, is what it does. And so they have a lot of studies on this specific thing, where if they had listened to their newer officers in the cockpit, that things could have been different in certain crashes. So it's that there's a lot of, and I forget, it's this particular book that I'm thinking of was written actually by a pretty famous fire guy, and so it's really interesting, and it goes into culture and respecting people from when they first come in all the way all the way up, and so those older officers need to be respectful. So that's what it brought up to me when because he did bring that up in his talk.
Well, that goes back to Mo, even,
Yes,
and the generational differences.
yes, it
Oh,
does.
you don't know. I've been here longer than you. I'm older. I'm more wise. More wise. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Huh. All right. April 911 Telecommunications Week. We had Jim Marshall with us, talking about the journey. Um, he had a lot to say. Many of our viewers may be really familiar with Jim and the 911 Training Institute. And I don't know if you knew this or not. I'm sure you probably did because we've talked about it, but Jim is partnering with Equature
Ah,
for some of his classes. But so this was one of his first toe dips with us. So
nice.
yeah. So what'd you think of what'd you think of his insight?
Oh, he had lots of good insight, and I think that one of the things that as he was talking, I was thinking, finding ways to celebrate dispatchers daily, weekly, whatever we can do instead of having just this one week, you know, is really makes a difference to them. And if sometimes we forget, you know, because we get busy with what we do, but I'm seeing that a lot of dispatch centers are getting much better at that.
And because of that culture that's changing, the dispatch centers are actually accepting it more. They were so used to, okay, we'll take the whatever once a year, but they were, I think some of the dispatch centers that I knew around um, were so uncomfortable with that praise and recognition and just
Yeah.
hey, here's a cookie.
Uh-huh.
That didn't, you know what I mean? Not like
I
here's a
do.
cookie, but.
I had a dispatcher who took a drug overdose call to people in a bathroom at a nightclub, both needing
Oh,
CPR. And I said, I'm sorry, this is incredible. I want to share this with the world. And I did it in my own way, but we had like a get together, like a survivor get together, because um, the organization, the Heart Saver or whatever it was, organization actually set it up. I said, will you come and be there and receive this award? And it was really hard to get her there, because and this goes back to what Mo talks about too, because everybody likes recognition in a certain way. That was not her way, but she did humor me, and we did actually get photo ops of her with her award and all of that. But she was incredible. She did CPR on two people, and there was other dispatchers saying, "Do you want me to help you with that?" She's like, "No, we have it. We have it. Don't just leave me alone. Get help and let me take care of this." And she did. We actually saved one of them. We did not save both of them.
wow.
Yeah, but
Did the survivors get to attend that or?
yes, that survivor did not. They were invited. Uh, and but no, mostly we had a few survivors there who did have CPR that dispatchers initiated with bystanders, and so those people who wanted to be there were there, and it was quite an emotional thing, frankly, because the survivors talked about what they've done since then, um, that they would not have been able to do. I mean, it was quite emotional.
That sounds great. And that's the kind of stuff Jim's talking about. That was impactful for me. Um, you know, celebrate all year round.
Yeah, yeah. The only other thing that it reminded me of was I think during that podcast you talked about how people kind of can grouse at each other. I mean, of course, we hope that doesn't happen in dispatch, but it's pretty prominent. But I tell you what, having been in a lot of team environments, and dispatch being one of them, um, when things really hit the fan, that all stops. And they're so cohesive and support each other so incredibly well. And it creates a bond that is you just don't lose, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. That is, that is true. Every place I've ever worked.
Yeah. You think you don't have a good relationship with somebody, and then they're right there at your back, lifting you up when you need it.
Right. All right. So we went from April to Tracy Brown. That was a fascinating podcast, body language and lie detection.
Yeah.
Uh, I've
It,
watched it more than once. What did you think of it?
I mean, to have someone who knows body language so well and to really hammer in the challenges that dispatchers have, because you're missing, what is it, 60% of the communication is body language, and you're losing that. I mean, I just remember, and this is a perfect example of it, of a caller who called. This was years and years ago. um, a caller that called, my baby, is not breathing, and not having anything else to go by, while her baby was 43 years old. And so they're trying to give infant instructions, and I mean, he's 43 years old. He just was her baby, you know? And another time when talking about a spouse or something that wasn't breathing, and it turned out they were having a hallucination and they were doing CPR on a pillow when the responders got there. So body language is just such a huge part of communication, and dispatchers are already at a disadvantage.
Right. But, with technology changing,
Yeah.
as we're aware, you bring in video 911, you know, um, imagine how that's going to change.
Yeah.
Um, and classes like Tracy Brown has, uh, that extra training that dispatchers are really going to benefit from.
Oh, I
Just
think so
so
too.
you're talking to someone, and what are some of the things she said? Um, I did not kill my wife.
Yeah.
Remember,
Yeah.
said shaking her, and just those things that will be captured on video, with the dispatcher at that initial 911 call. Um, I just, I was actually really riveted to her podcast, and I don't typically watch my podcasts over, but that one was really good.
It was really good. And I actually, after I watched that podcast, I subscribed to her newsletter, and I kind of follow her more. So, yeah. And also, I will just say that, that was the podcast where you were interrupted. And, and so we kind of talk about that when we're doing these, we'll cut that out, we'll cut that out, we'll cut that out. And then they didn't cut it out. I
right?
thought that was actually one of the more powerful parts of that podcast, even though it was you. You didn't want that to be included, but why don't you tell us exactly what happened there?
Oh, well, that was the last time I got to talk to my son before he
Before,
deployed.
yeah.
Yep. Jeez.
So, yeah, sorry, I got you there.
Wow, you did get me. I wasn't ready. I still haven't. I mean, he called me on my birthday somewhere in the ocean. He was able to get a satellite phone and call me. Um, yeah. So, um, but the call was coming in, and he wanted to call really quick before he got on the ship, and I got to take this call.
Yeah,
you
and
know.
that was. I'm so glad they left it in because, I mean, there it was. I mean, they cut out, how long you were gone and all that kind of stuff. But I think that coming back and your reaction and explaining to Tracy what exactly that call was about was a perfect study in body language. It was so honest and fresh. It was a really nice moment. I just want to say in that podcast.
Well, it'd be interesting if she analyzed it. Okay, now what Cherie just did was.
No,
No, don't do that.
no.
Yeah,
But I suppose you want to move on now, right,
let's
Cherie?
move on.
Yeah.
Let's move on. Well, we're going to talk about my son here in a minute. So,
Yes, we are.
um, anyway, June come along.
Okay,
And
you froze there
so,
for a second.
yep, I did. I saw that happened.
Okay.
June came along, and we had Doug Showalter, and he talked about finding the leader in you. I liked that because it wasn't just for leaders. And
Yes.
I've always said, if you want to be a leader, you need to be a leader before you're a leader. Like I've said that for years and years. I practiced it before I became a supervisor. Um, tell me what you thought of that podcast.
Yeah, the first notes that I wrote down was when he said being a leader is being a human first. Um, I think that especially because of the dynamics that happen in dispatch, that sometimes dispatchers forget that, and um, those who we consider bullies may forget that being a human first also applies to being a coworker, and also deals with when you're dealing with the public. So I just thought I almost want to put that, you know in a sign on the wall. Just be a human first, and you almost can't go wrong. So that really really rang true for me.
Um, I know one of the things that you had said that you liked about it was the giving away the power and not hoarding it.
Yes,
Um, do you think that that's something that a lot of people do?
I don't. I I will say that I did my best to give away power, and I don't think people really knew what to do with it. They I mean, honestly, I would, oftentimes I'd sit in a supervisor meeting and say, "Okay, what do you want to do about X?" And it's like it's like nobody wanted to step up and take responsibility for an idea because I'm sure that they thought their idea was stupid. I No, when we're talking about improving things or whatever, when you're talking to supervisors, you want them to have they have the tighter experience with their dispatchers. And it doesn't mean that one idea gets to be applied to every shift because they're all different, but to give them the power to be able to execute something that they think will work with their people. I mean, I don't think they were ready for that. I think, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it takes, they need to get used to it if they have the kind of leader that gives away power and wants to share it. I think it does take some getting used to.
Well, that's what succession planning is all about too, right? I mean,
Right.
yeah.
And I know you were pretty darn good at succession planning, weren't you, with your training and making sure.
The last place I worked, I was the first place I worked here in Michigan. Um, I was so busy trying to get us on our feet, and then when that job opportunity came at me, um, it was, I'm not going to go into the details, but it was so sudden and so unexpected and so, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to take this job because wow. Um, I didn't have really a lot of time to prepare anybody else. So that was, so when I left that center and went to where I was the last time, I was pretty adamant that people were going to be prepared.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
and they have to be ready to accept that responsibility. And I think that there's a lot of times when they're just they're not used to it, as I said before, and they're not really sure what to do with it because there is a lot of responsibility there, and they're going to be held accountable, and it takes some time to warm up to that.
right. Oh, what I found out, and Doug and I had talked about this too, um, is when you find that the people who want to be leaders, sometimes some of them will step up, and you start giving them tasks, and they do, and the other people, they want to be leaders, they don't step up, and they're like, you're playing favorites.
Yeah,
And I'm
yeah.
like, no, they're just doing this because they want to be a leader. That gets really tricky.
Yes.
Um, so I liked Doug's podcast because he really addressed a lot of the issues of how to find the leader in you and develop that so that you're ready to take that role.
Well, I also like that he used Disney as an example. I mean, I learned more about Disney and how, because they really are their own little city,
Yeah,
you
they
know,
are.
and he really did a good job of using them to illustrate his points.
All right. Well, so then we moved into July, to serve and protect, how to grow a hero, um, with Matthew Betcher, um, gunnery sergeant with the U.S. Marines. So, Matthew, let me just ask you first before I give any of my own opinion on that podcast.
Okay. Well, and I believe you said on the introduction in the podcast that Matthew is your son.
I did not. I actually was
Okay.
gonna not. I was not going to tell anybody that he was my son until the very end. I did end up saying that in the middle. Um,
Okay.
yeah.
So he was, I mean, I really enjoyed that. And the big thing that came up for me was it just brought memories back of my son when he was in college, and he came home for, well, there was, anyway, I don't want to get into too much detail, but he came home for Thanksgiving and sat down, and he says, and he did this with me by myself before we were with my husband. And then we shared it with him. And he says, well, he says, I just wanted you to know that I think I'm going to go into law enforcement. And I went, oh, God. and I went, oh, okay, if that makes you happy. Because you've got this trepidation, because of the law enforcement that you've worked with. And you know what kind of life is ahead. And so it just made me think of my son. I have one son that is not in law enforcement who's extremely successful, and I'm extremely proud of him. But this particular podcast brought out that memory and how he kind of didn't want to tell me, but he knew he had to because he was changing his courses at college to coincide with that. He was going more into sociology, so for that reason.
That's funny.
Yeah, but that's what it made me think of. But how difficult was that to do?
Well, it was pretty difficult. So that was the second time we'd had Matthew on, back in the September of 2023. We had a podcast with children of public safety, only they were adults. They were older, and there were 4 of them. And
I did see that one. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, he was on that one. But this one, it was just him, and he was making the comparisons between Marine air traffic control and 911. And I was actually startled listening to him at those comparisons. Like, wow, he was paying attention the whole time he was growing up. Holy smokes.
They surprise us, don't they?
Who knew? I mean, I was actually really surprised at how much he had been paying attention growing up. But when it was time to end that podcast, knowing that was the last time I was going to see his face, that was hard. Because he was going off to the Middle East on a ship for a year. And we all know, that the Middle East isn't the center of peace and tranquility.
Yeah. Well, and as parents, I mean, this is what else it kind of brings about. We really get stuck remembering them when they're young and vulnerable.
Right.
And I mean, so my son's been in law enforcement for 5 years. Well, and before that, he was in the detention center. So he's been in that world for 8 years probably. And I remember I stayed at his place because I was at a class in his town, and we were just talking, and I went to bed that night thinking about that talk that I had with him, thinking, this kid is a badass. I mean, I suppose I should stop worrying so much because he's got his head in the right place. And it's hard for us as parents to make that admission when we're so used to what they used to be like.
Well, right. And Matthew decided he wanted to be a Marine when he was a freshman in high school. And I ignored it because it's not what I want. You're going to college. And I'm sure, we talked about his announcement of when he wasn't going to go to college, after his first semester. He shares that all the time when he teaches young Marines air traffic control because he's an instructor. And I share it every chance I get too. I'm sick and tired of people telling me what to do. I'm joining the Marines.
that was like the funniest part of that podcast. I'm sorry. It made me laugh.
When he did that, it was like you. It's like, okay. And I've always thought if anything ever happens to him as a Marine, he is doing something that he loves. It is absolutely a life calling. And, I think we have to remember that, with our kids. And so How to Grow a Hero, um, we named it that podcast, because that's what he is.
But we don't even know that we're growing a hero when we're
Not
raising
at the
him.
time,
No, we don't.
right?
And I mean, and yeah, so it's a calling for my son too, and he really is very serious about protecting those who can't protect themselves. Very
Yeah.
serious. So yeah, we
All
should move
right.
on now. Sure.
Let's move on now. In August, we had Tony Harrison talk about the importance of training and how to train people. Uh, that was also, well, just slap me if I say that was the worst podcast ever. I mean, wouldn't that be so? Because I keep saying, well, that was a really good podcast. Um, that was a really good podcast.
Well,
Tell me what you thought of that.
it's hard to have favorites because we do enjoy so many of
It
them.
it is, and I really have had fun doing podcasts. I know when I started with Equature, Heather was saying, what do you think of podcasts? I'm like, you want me to talk?
Uh,
And then I'm like, oh, I did that for a living. Okay, I can do that. But
well,
anyway,
what
what?
this one made me think of was he brought up, and this is, I mean, so emphatically true. If when you're planning for some disaster and you think that dispatch is going to be able to do it all, you are crazy. Absolutely crazy. Um, and I was uh, the 911 coordinator for a very small PSAP. We had two positions, and actually, we only had one and a half for a long time, and then we remodeled while I was there, and we made two full positions. Um, but one of the things, I was also emergency manager at the time. And one of the things I did was I said, look, we've got to get these calls because we have big fires. We're in Montana, we have big fires. And at that point, we kept breaking records for fires. And I'm like, can we please stop doing this? So the fires kept getting bigger and more complex and all of this. And so I started going to training. I went to a training at the fire academy in Emmitsburg, and we did what we call a joint information center. And at our little PSAP, we were never going to need a joint information center. It's at a much higher level than we were at. However, I took that training and I created a call center so that the public could call into a central point and have information on any fire that was going on in our jurisdiction, and it would all be consistent, up to date, all of that. Because before that, all we had was dispatch, and they would be taking all these calls. And so they would often, if I was in my office as an emergency manager, they would send them over to me because I was the PIO, right? But that it didn't matter if I wasn't in the office. How were they going to do that? Because I was busy out doing something else. So I trained actually our city and county employees to man a phone. And I would make sure that that information was there. And then we had a fire of all fires, and it broke all these records. We had people in our jurisdiction for, I want to say, 2 months fighting this fire. And we actually had two fires at the same time. And that call center freed up dispatch so well, and it was so well received from the public that I was like, that is what he was talking about. When you're talking about planning, those calls, dispatch can't do it. They cannot do it because you know what? There's regular things going on. People are still dying of other things than the fire, right?
Right.
So that's what stood out for me in that podcast.
Yeah, Tony really has a heart for training. Um, I share his frustration when he talks about uh, certain training topics. But
Yeah.
yeah, I enjoyed listening to him too.
Oh, he was great. When I had my call center, I had one person from the community. She worked at the ambulance. She says, "Well, it would have been nice if we had this training before the fire was on." And I looked at her and I said, "We did have this training."
Oops.
It was so wonderful to be able to say that, and every agency needs to be able to say that when they get that reaction. Just because someone maybe was out of town when that training was going on doesn't mean it didn't happen. And it's just so vital. And yeah, we learned as we went on the actual incident. But those folks who were there during that training, they looked at me because they were manning the phones and they said, "Thank you. Thank you for doing that training
Well, they
before
had the
this."
base.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly.
All right. Well, that brings us to September with Tina Chafin talking about understaffing, um, being understaffed. I just love the title. Um, are you part of the problem or part of the solution?
Yeah.
I can't say for sure, but for you, but I can tell you for me, um, I would have liked to said that to a few people that worked for me. I can say that now because I don't work in the dispatch center, but
Yeah.
you know, um, she really made a point of underestimating the people themselves.
Well, and I
Where are
think, and as
you?
I've heard you say this too, Sherry, is that, and I don't care if it's leadership or culture or what it is, each person in that dispatch center has a responsibility to be the solution. I
Right?
mean, they just don't realize how important their words, their support, their derision, how important that is to other people in the room. And I mean, I think of this when I've had dispatchers come to me and say, "Yeah, that person over there, we know what kind of day it's going to be when she walks in the room." Right? Have you had people like that?
Absolutely.
And then they would come back to me and say, "Did you talk to her about this? Because nothing's changed." I said, "Oh, yes, I talked to her about this." And yet, it doesn't matter what you say as a leader. I mean, those people are the ones, I'm sorry, they've got to leave. They can't they can't change what they're doing. You've given them every opportunity, and nothing's going to change until they leave.
Right. But they walk that line. They don't quite do enough for leadership to, help free up their future. Um, so they're on that line. And so you talk to the organization and you say it's the culture. It's the culture of the organization that will help, push out that undesirable trait. Leadership cannot do it alone.
That's right.
And that's what I liked about Tina's talk is, she kind of talked about where are you in your in your understaffing problem. Talked about social media and those things are important. And I think everybody looks at leadership and says you have to fix this, and one person can't fix it
Yeah.
alone.
Boy, that is so true. I did used to, because I mean, bullying is a big thing. Um, and you can tell the dispatchers who are going to be victims of bullying. You can just tell. And so I did my best to pump them up and say, there's responsibility on both sides. There's responsibility for the bully to stop being a jerk, And there's a responsibility on your side as the victim to say, hey, you're being a jerk right now. Stop it.
Right.
So the problem is the victim who, and I'm just using victim as because of that's the terms that we use, but to just get rid of that victim mentality and say, hey, you have to stand up for yourself. I mean, it's like on the playground, the bullies who get beat up, stop bullying that person. You've got to get
Right.
after those people. And sometimes it's going to feel, from your point of view, like you are way crazy over the top being a bigger jerk to that person. But you've got to overcome that that bully's mentality first and shock them a little bit, and give that, and that's the only way you give those bullies a chance to stay in that comm center, is to actually give them that chance to realize that they're actually being a jerk and to change.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So October and November of this year, we had um, groups. We had our unified command, um,
Right.
and we got done recording that. And I looked around at all these professionals sitting there that I have known for years, and I said, "Wow, I wish we had done this when I was still in the dispatch center." I
Oh,
just, I mean, I learned so much, and I didn't anticipate that, um, because I keep myself trained. And when I was in the dispatch center, I went to training regularly. I didn't anticipate hearing the things I heard in that podcast. Um, so, how did you feel after you listened to that roundtable?
well, I almost don't want to say a whole lot
Well,
because
right. And
I
I was
think I'm
very vague also because people can go
yeah,
back and listen. And I would
yeah.
encourage our audience to do that.
Well, and also because my background, I have been on incident management teams on fires. So when you talk about incident management, I have been on large teams where well, just about, I guess, every role that you see on that big, little map of roles in incident management has actually been filled out, which you don't see on a very often at all. I mean, you would have seen that like on 9/11. I mean, we see it on our Type 1 teams. So I have a much broader experience with incident command than you might have, Sherry. But
Right.
I think the term unified command was almost a misnomer because they really concentrated on just incident command and really bringing it back to dispatch. And if you don't, if those first responders in the field haven't really been careful about assigning an incident commander, because there should be an incident commander on every incident. The first person on scene is the IC, until they hand it over. And if they hand it over, tell dispatch. And that should be the person who's talking to dispatch. And it clears up a lot of confusion.
Right. And if they don't hand it over to dispatch, dispatch should be strong enough to ask for it.
Yes. And
Yeah.
I think that what they talked about were also duplicate resource requests.
Yes, we did talk about that.
And that happens when the command is not clear. Um, we will do that here. Like, we finally figured out that, you know what, if we need a medical flight, that an EMT should be able to ask for that because they're at the patient's side. Um, but dispatch also needs to be strong enough to say, hey, I just got that request from somebody else. Do you need an additional helicopter, or you just need one? I mean, it's hard to explain to dispatch exactly how confusing a scene can be when you can be 30 feet away from each other and asking for the same resource and you don't know that other person is doing it.
Right.
So dispatch is extremely important to help minimize the chaos at a scene sometimes.
Yeah. Just asking for clarification.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. And here's our last one. We'll move through this a little bit quicker just because of our time element, but um, through their eyes, children public safety. These kids, they were so much fun. Um, they were so much fun. Just just the littles,
Yeah.
what 12 through 7 or 6, I think, was our youngest.
Right.
Um,
Right.
they surprised me also because I didn't know what was going to come out of their mouth, and neither did their parents, who, if you didn't know this, their parents were in another room, um, very curious about what their kids were saying. And they asked me afterwards, did they say anything embarrassing? I said, well, no. Um, but you can watch it.
Yeah.
Um, and I think I think really what surprised me the most was the kids saying, they're never home.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even my own.
Yep. Yeah. That, and once again, I hope we don't get emotional again. But we have a joke in my house that so when my youngest, who is now in law enforcement, was first growing up, as a little, he was painfully shy, to the point where I was very careful about when I went back to work because I was a stay-at-home mom when they were real little, and I don't think I went back to work um, until he was in like third grade or something like that. I didn't want to have an employer get upset because I'm going to prioritize my kid and he needs me. I'm sorry, I'm leaving. Um, but as they got older into high school, when they had all their sports going on and all that sort of thing, it was a surprise when they would see me at their sports games. And so the inside joke in our house is that my kids were raised by wolves. And so they would be at at the games, and somebody would say, "Oh, well, where's your mom?" They go, "Oh, well, we're really actually just raised by wolves." And they would start this howling, "Oh no, we're not. We're just on our own. We're out here trying to figure it out on our own." And my husband was there, but he was always participating in that. Yeah, it's a good thing I'm here because if you had to depend on your mother, and we make a joke out of it. And when I could, I would participate in those things. But yeah, and to see that how much the kids missed is we're also sharing that same frustration. And so when we bring it also back to Mo, right, and looking at the generational thing, if we as a PSAP can't be flexible enough to give our dispatchers time off to go see a play that their kid is in, we need to really be looking more carefully at what we do, because that's what life is about. It's not it's yes, it's about getting people help, but life itself includes our family and how we interact with them.
Well, so I'm going to tie some things together. Understaffed, are you part of the problem, part of the solution? If you're part of the solution, you're going to have your team members' backs and you're going to help
Mm-hmm.
in those situations. Um, the generational differences, you're going to understand that you're working next to a coworker who has small children, and you're going to understand that you're working next to someone who doesn't have small children, who maybe needs a night out with their spouse, right? I mean, everything we talked about this year, you can tie them all together to have a healthy um, dispatch center, a
Yes.
healthy culture. And so when I retired out of the dispatch center, um, we were just coming out of 2020, the pandemic, and the media interviewed me and said, why now? We were it was the end of 2021 when I left. And I said, well, we lost a lot of people in 2020, and no one ever had on their gravestone, I wish I had worked more. I wanted to be with my family. And although my employer was extremely flexible, like you've already talked about, it wasn't fair to the dispatch center that I worked at to be as flexible as I needed. And so when my son at that podcast at the round table says, my mom's never around, I'm like, what are you talking about? My office is literally inside the house. I was thinking, wow, he's forgotten that I used to work 40 hours a week or more outside the house. I almost started laughing, but I thought that might be unprofessional.
He did kind of correct himself a couple of times.
But he's like,
he obviously did remember,
Right.
When you weren't there.
Oh, well.
I think that was the big thing about those kids, though, is really how important their parents are to them. And that's why I stayed at home when they were little, because I always felt that, I wanted to raise them myself rather than have a daycare raise them. And I mean, it was hard for us, but then I went completely the other way as they got older. So you can't win.
Yeah. And not everybody has that ability. Right. So anyway, Kerry, this has been lots of fun.
It has been. Thank you.
And for our audience, thanks so much for joining us. I really encourage you to go back and listen to our podcast from 2024 and maybe even dip into 2023. They're really great. Like I said earlier, I'm not going to sit here and say, wow, that was a terrible podcast. I've enjoyed doing them all. I hope you enjoy listening to them. And we'll see you next year. Bye, everyone.
So long.